So, just to give you a quick overview of who I am and that I actually do know what I'm talking about. So I actually started with the Canadian Cancer Society of Alberta and Northwest Territories in 2007. I was brought in from the IT world. I worked IT in oil companies. Please don't hold that against me. So I came over to the charitable sector and ended up working with this Raiser's Edge database that was over 1 million people, over 3 million gifts, and was actually very well designed prior to my getting there. So I got to deal with some of the best practices in the industry before I really got a good feel for what Raiser's Edge could do. About 3 years later, I joined MethodWorks Consulting. Since then, I have personally worked with the data of about 50 clients. This has not been just in the Raiser's Edge, but it's also been in pretty much the entire Blackbaud suite of products available in Canada outside of Blackbaud ECRM. So that's Raiser's Edge, Education Edge, which is obviously the education product, Financial Edge, Net Community, and Online Campus Community, which are online products, as well as Convio Illuminate, which I worked with it before it was purchased by Blackbaud, and then Sphere, which used to be called Kintera, and again, I worked on that before it was purchased by Blackbaud. So no matter where I try to stretch out, I seem to end up back in the Blackbaud world because Blackbaud just buys them out. I've been a speaker at the Blackbaud Conference for Nonprofits for the last 3 years. The last 2 have been the absolute most fun. I've been able to moderate a talk between some of the biggest Raiser's Edge geeks there are at that conference, including Bill Connors. So if any of you have ever read Fundraising in the Raiser's Edge by Bill Connors, it's a fantastic book. Really gives a good overview of what RE is designed for. So him and I get to debate best practices, which is a lot of fun. Blackbaud also started certification back in September. They announced it officially at the Blackbaud conference. So there are 3 levels of certification. They haven't actually released the last level yet, but basically there's the associate level and the professional level. I was one of the first 5 civilians, that is non-Blackbaud people, certified at the professional level, and I've been helping them beta test a lot of the certification program. And I've been also involved in the discovery process for Bluebird. Now, if you've been around the Blackbaud world at all for the last few years, you may have heard talk about Raiser's Edge 8 a few years ago, and then no longer anybody would talk about Raiser's Edge 8. And it's because Raiser's Edge 8 now no longer exists, and now Bluebird is what is replacing it. So they're in the development process of basically getting Raiser's Edge finally upgraded. Raiser's Edge 7 was originally released in 1999 and built on a very old platform, so they are working on upgrading that and making things a little bit smarter, like email addresses not being phone numbers, and phone numbers not being on addresses, and all sorts of fun old functionalities. So just a little bit about MethodWorks Consulting. We are fundraising systems consultants, so we basically deal with databases. We've effectively been around for over 10 years, although with 2 different company names, and we specialize in Blackbaud. We have traditionally stayed in Calgary, and to a lesser degree Edmonton have been our market, and then recently we have expanded out to Vancouver and Toronto. So we have consultants here, we have consultants in Toronto, and we're basically expanding our network. We have over 70 years of combined experience in the Raiser's Edge, which is kind of funny to say because Raiser's Edge was only built in 1981. And we are complete geeks, all of us. It's really the nerdiest office you've ever been in. And it's kind of sad. So basically what we're going to talk about today. So first we're going to talk about CRA policy, because CRA policy is the single most important thing you need to know for year-end receipting. So we're going to go over things like what should be on your tax receipt, what should you know about electronic receipting, and what does CRA say about it, what can be included in consolidated tax receipts, what can you not consolidate, things like that. Once I go through a lot of that incredibly boring stuff, which I'm going to do completely in monotone, just so you know, then I will be doing receipting in the Raiser's Edge. And to some degree, it's not going to be, that you're step-by-step, this is how you receipt. It's really looking at receipting in the Raiser's Edge. I'm going to give a general overview of how one generally receipts in the Raiser's Edge using the mail tool, and then really looking at what type of procedure needs to be in place to do consolidated receipts, especially given certain circumstances that your charity might be doing. And then this also includes reissuing and reprinting receipts, because of course Razor's Edge is built in South Carolina, and they don't understand CRA tax law and all the fun things we have to do with voiding receipts so that we don't get shut down by CRA. So if any of you ever read Fundraiser Girl, she posts animated GIFs and relates it to charities. So I know this is the most boring topic I could possibly have come up with, so I figured this was appropriate when you're in Razor's Edge training but would rather be dancing. So I apologize that this is going to be relatively boring subject material, but hopefully we can get something out of this, and hopefully we can not make it that boring. So first and foremost, CRA policy. So this is my big disclaimer. I am not a lawyer. If you actually want to talk to a lawyer about CRA policy, I highly recommend Mark Blumberg. I have a link to some of his stuff at the end. He actually is a charity lawyer and does a lot of this for a living. So anything presented here is basically based on my years of experience in the charitable industry and talking to CRA people and figuring things out along the way. So if you are unsure about anything, always ask CRA first. The worst thing that could happen would be for you to be in non-compliance and then have to deal with those hounds. And from some of our clients or people who have become clients of ours, they have told us wonderful stories about CRA audits, and they are not fun at all. So here's the official regulation. If you care, it is the income tax regulations, and it's Part 35, which is gifts. That is the CRA policy. I, for some reason, probably because I'm masochistic, actually was reading this the other day just to make sure that I wasn't saying anything wrong, and pretty much fell asleep at my desk. So there's a lot of content involved in tax receipting. We're only going to cover the things we need to know for Razor's Edge, for consolidated receipting, and the more common situations. So things like what technically is a gift, or who is a qualified donee when you're transferring between charities. Some of the finer points of appraisals, such as when you have to look at certain values of gifts versus others. We're not going to go into a lot of those technicalities. Really, this is about making sure that your tax receipt is formed correctly and that you are performing things like void procedure correctly. First and most importantly, and a lot of people don't actually know this, you as a charity do not have to issue a tax receipt. There is no regulation by CRA that says you must do this. This is really a service that you provide to your donors. And theoretically, if you don't tax receipt, people aren't going to donate because they're not getting the donation tax receipt. But because of this rule, you can make decisions such as, I don't want a tax receipt under $20, or we don't want a tax receipt for certain situations. You can say straight up, no, we're not going to tax receipt these. Or you could say, we're not going to tax receipt unless a donor asks. So basically, you are not required by law to receipt at all. And that long piece is what CRA actually says on their website. The second thing is, when should you receipt? So everybody knows the date of February 28th. Well, again, because you don't need to tax receipt, there is no actual regulation as to when you should tax receipt. CRA only recommends up by February 28th so that you can get tax receipts out to people so that they can file their taxes correctly. The thing is, you can issue tax receipts for years back. You can issue tax receipts at any time throughout the year, so you don't have to wait until year end. There are some organizations that will wait until year end. There are some that do it the moment you get it. So you have a lot of options, but there is no actual regulation saying you must receipt by February 28th. It's highly recommended, and obviously your donors will become more and more unhappy if they don't see it in early March, but effectively this is just a recommendation by CRA. Here's the fun list. So what needs to be on a tax receipt? And I'll just go through quickly a few of these, but you will see a few stars beside a few things, because I will actually talk a little bit more about those as they come up. So name and address of organization. This is an interesting one because it has to be what is exactly on the charity filed return. So a lot of organizations like to use their acronym. You cannot put that acronym on your tax receipt. It must be the legal organization as CRA knows it. So first and foremost, make sure that those are the exact values that CRA knows. Second is your charity registration number. That's pretty straightforward. Place where receipt was issued. Normally, charities put wherever the main office is, simply because as you build tax receipts in the Raises Edge, trying to create locality based on whoever is running it is somewhat difficult, but effectively you should be putting where it was issued. The date the receipt was issued. So CRA's official policy on this is that if it's different from the gift date, but it's almost always different from the gift date. So as a general rule, recommend that date receipt was issued is when is right on the tax receipt. You need the name and website of Canada Revenue. So Canada Revenue makes you put down the www.cra.gc.ca/charities, as well as that is the website for the Canada Revenue Agency. You also need the official donation receipt is for income tax purposes.
That name and website of CRA, you shouldn't just have the English version, you should have the bilingual link.
Right.
That takes you to the page that has English and French.
It's a good tip.
And also just another tip on the place where receipt was issued, you just can't have it as part of your address. You just have language that says this receipt was issued in wherever. We know because we just got a CRA on it.
Yeah, and so you don't put Vancouver, BC, you put Vancouver, Canada, is how they want to see it.
Yeah, we got audited this year too.
Yeah. What I've been audited on that is, it's meant to be the address where the records are kept. I've got caught on that in the past. But the UBC was a huge place, but then you can discuss it with them.
Yeah, the main thing is that the address for your organization is separate from the locality.
But the locality we have is just Vancouver, Canada. We didn't actually have to put in Centennial Pavilion 855.
No,
We just had to
it would
put
be your
Vancouver.
city.
It also depends on the auditor.
Yeah.
Well, and I'll even get into a fun little piece with the full name in a moment about CRA and their rules versus what they actually tell you. You do need the receipt number, and receipt numbers are supposed to be serialized, and that's because it's a control, which I'll talk a little bit about later. What you will find with some programs, especially web-based programs, and especially those built in the United States and may or may not have been built by Blackbaud or purchased by Blackbaud, they serialize the gift number because it's their database number, but it's not actually serialized receipts, and that's an issue. So, as I said, full name of donor, the official legislation says including middle initial, and I highly doubt that anybody does that. Now, so I'll talk about that in a moment.
We do it.
Do you?
We have it. Oh, we do it.
Fantastic. Because a lot of charities do not. In fact, most charities don't even ask for it.
Some people don't have that. No, it's true.
Should we ID people? Should we look at their IDs?
Well, therein lies the problem, right?
Because people sometimes they don't say their.
The source of it is mostly from the checks, is it not?
Yes.
Yeah, historical records with check donations.
So you need the address of the donor. Then you need the amount of the gift. Now, amount of gift can be can differ depending on what you're looking at, and I'm talking about namely gifts in kind versus a cash gift. Cash gifts are pretty straightforward. $200 is $200. But when you start looking at fair market value and deemed fair market value, then you start getting into some interesting situations with amount of gift, which is why I have a little star beside it. Date when gift was received. Again, I've got a little star beside this because, again, you have situations where you've got historical ways of donating, such as check through the mail versus your online gift. And when you receive that is very different. You have description and amount of advantage. So in Raises Edge land, advantage is benefits. But that would basically be things like green fees, or if you give the donor something for giving a certain amount, those type of things. And then you need the signature of an authorized person, which we'll talk about a little bit later as well. So those are what needs to be on the tax receipt according to CRA. So a few of those fun little stars, because I can't say asterisks. Yeah. Date when gift was received. So what a lot of charities will do with respect to mail is the date that the gift was mailed. Because what will happen at end of year is somebody will write a check on December 31st, put it in the mail on December 31st, and you don't technically receive until the next year. You can still receive those.
On the postmark.
On the postmark date, correct. You cannot use the check date. That's an important distinction. Now, a lot of charities, what they'll do is they'll build a procedure kind of for end of year and just deal with those separately, because looking at the postmark dates means you have to keep envelopes, and you get all these fun situations where there's things paper clipped to other things and you get these massive piles. So generally charities will look at when they actually received it until you start dealing with end of year. Online is pretty straightforward. When that button is pressed, that is when it is sent. So if officially your system receives it as of 11:59 p.m. on December 31st, it still counts as that year. If it takes a few extra seconds, then unfortunately it doesn't qualify for that year. The full name of donor including middle initial. So again, this is one of those fun issues. So officially in the legislation, it says middle initial. Every CRA person I have ever talked to, and I always make a point of asking this because I'm just curious if anybody will ever give me a different answer, but any CRA person I've ever talked to has said, don't worry about it. But I can't tell you that because I'm not CRA nor am I a lawyer. So CRA tells you middle initial, and all I'm going to tell you is that the people I've talked to at CRA have said, don't worry about it. And then the amount of gift, again, is going to be based on whether or not you're doing gifts in kind. And gifts in kind are their own special product. So consolidated receipting. You can consolidate cash gifts. Basically, you can take every gift that was received over a period in a year, or any selection of those gifts, and receipt those as a consolidated gift. So some charities will do that only with their recurring gifts. So effectively, they will do your recurring gift program, and then there's other gifts throughout the year, and only the recurring gifts get consolidated receipts. Some will just wait until the end of the year, consolidate everything. The main thing to know is that it is cash gifts that you can consolidate. Now, according to CRA, you can consolidate cash gifts that have advantage amounts. But when we talk about Razor's Edge later, really Razor's Edge can't do it. It can, but it's not really designed for it, and you're better off receiving those one-offs. But you can do consolidated receipts with CRA. So as per that,
Just to be clear, so consolidated means that somebody gives fairly regularly and you just want to put it into one.
that's right. So you would have one receipt number for however many gifts.
And the date of gift just has to be the year. You don't have to list all the dates of the.
Well, take a look at Kirk's name. Out there. You're saying date received, not simply year. Because it's a gift in
That's on
kind,
gifts
okay.
in kind. Yeah.
Okay, got it.
Yeah. It's like, oh no!
Are you out of back off, sorry.
No, that's fine. I appreciate the banter as well, because as I said, this is my experience with CRA, and this is my reading things and talking to CRA people. But every so often, don't tell my boss this, but sometimes I'm wrong. Definitely don't tell my wife that. Gifts in kind cannot be consolidated at all. You have to have one receipt per item,
Well,
or
per transfer.
per
Okay.
transfer.
If you're receiving a collection of books, you don't have to do every single
That's
one.
right. But effectively, one transfer of property yields one tax receipt. So you have to have the date received on gifts in kind. The difference between consolidated and non-consolidated is that effectively for the gift in kind you have to have the full date received. You have to have a description of the property. So this is also why it's kind of difficult to do consolidated receipts, because you can imagine if you're doing all of these, you'd basically be running an inventory. So you need a description of the property, and then if you have it appraised, you need the name and address of the appraiser. Now the recommendation is that anything over $1,000 that doesn't come with an actual receipt that they've purchased, anything over $1,000 should be appraised. That is the recommendation. That said, there is no hard and fast rule on when you need it appraised. But the moment it is, you do need the name and address of the appraiser. And then you need the fair market value. And again, this is one of those things I'm not going to delve into because there are all sorts of fun rules. You know, there's things like if I purchase a piece of art for $200 and within 3 years it accumulates or it becomes worth $1,000 and I give it to a charity in that time, I still can only get a $200 tax receipt. So there's really weird rules with what deemed market value is in certain cases. So I don't want to go into all of the technicalities because one, I don't know them, and two, really once you start getting into those types of things, you really need to be talking to CRA and making sure it's done correctly. There are all sorts of cases, including tax shelters and things like that, where there are all these different values that can be in play. So just know that when you're talking about gifts in kind, you need to look at fair market value, and if you start doing gifts in kind, you probably should at least spend some time looking at what the difference is between fair market value and deemed fair market value and dealing with those. But gifts in kind, in the end, because you're not doing it on a consolidated basis, it's usually a good idea to just receipt them when you get them and deal with it then. Then there's benefits, or at least the way that Raiser's Edge calls it. So CRA calls it an advantage amount, Raiser's Edge calls it benefits. Now if you've ever seen the benefits tab in Raiser's Edge, basically on the gift you can list individual items and what they are worth. Raiser's Edge doesn't work well with consolidating these. Part of the reason is because Raiser's Edge doesn't send proper gift information to Microsoft Word when you are doing consolidation. It basically adds up numbers for you, but it will not send information from each individual gift properly. So it won't send benefit information. So when you do consolidated tax receipts, you can't even list the benefits. So usually you don't receipt those in consolidation. And a gift with an advantage or a benefit is anytime the donor receives something of value, and the fair market value must be determined on the advantage. And so this would be things like meals when you're doing a dinner, or green fees when you're doing a golf event, or complimentary items if you are giving something for donating. So I've worked with some museums who have given special tickets to special events and those types of things because a donor reaches a certain level. So that would be your idea of complimentary items. I don't know how many of you run auctions, but technically you can receipt when somebody purchases an auction item, but there are all sorts of fun rules with that as well. For example, the value can't be, I believe it's 80% or greater than 80% of what they purchased, and you have to take into account the fair market value of what is purchased. This is why a lot of charities don't even deal with auction items. It's just simply if a donor purchases an auction item, it doesn't get receipted. But you can do it. You just have to be aware of the advantage rules around that.
That 80-20 actually applies to anything of an advantage, not just auction items.
Right.
So even a dinner or anything like that. But also, there's also the kind of the safe harbor, the 10% of maximum
Yes.
$75 and
Yeah, no, I'm not going to talk about that because it's one of those fun rules. But effectively, it's
to give something of kind of nominal value that's really worth a couple of dollars, and they give a $100 donation, you don't have to put that down as an advantage.
Right, so if you give someone a tote bag, which doesn't really have any value, you don't need to worry about this whole advantage craziness.
Right.
Okay.
10%, maximum $75.
Or stickers or that kind of like, okay.
That's right.
What if you have an event where, for example, food and drinks and little gifts are used as incentives for people to donate? Would you have to receive every donor individually and would divide them?
Yeah, so actually, when you're doing events like that, and let's say there's door prizes or those types of things, and please correct me if I'm wrong because I don't know this rule straight up, but what I understand is that you take the total of all of the items and you divide it by how many donors there are, and that becomes the advantage. So just talking a little bit about controls, and I said this earlier. So serial receipts, the reason that CRA wants serial receipts is it is a control. And part of the reason you do this from an accounting perspective, a control, is you want to know how many receipts were issued over a given period of time. You want to make sure that all receipts are accounted for. So that's why they want serialization of receipts. So you can imagine if I've done receipt number 400 through 500, and that's this year's receipts, I expect there to be 100 receipts, whether that's one receipt per person or if we voided receipts that we can account for those. When you start to throw in random numbers or seemingly random numbers like some online platforms do because they're doing it per transaction as opposed to per receipt, you lose that control. So this is why CRA requires it, and it's why receipt stacks work the way that they do in the Raiser's Edge, and it's why it's so important to actually have it down. This helps eliminate fraud. The other control that is in CRA's policy is signatures. Now, interestingly enough, CRA will allow you to put an electronic signature onto a tax receipt. So, you can scan in an authorized signature, throw it into the Word file for the receipts, and run it that way. The important part of that is if you are going to do that control, it is you are going to do that procedure, it is highly recommended that you have some other control in place just to make sure that receipts are correct and going out correctly. Because again, it's about eliminating fraud. One of the interesting scenarios I always found working as a Raiser's Edge guy, and especially because I was also somebody who worked with SQL directly, and I may or may not have touched the Raiser's Edge SQL Don't Tell Blackbaud. Effectively, I had the ability to create a gift, create my own tax receipt, print it off for myself, and eliminate all trace of it. Now, luckily, the organization I worked for trusted me, and luckily I'm somewhat of a trustworthy guy. But in general, that's a really dangerous situation. So that's why anything going out of the organization with a receipt number you should have a number of controls in place. You should have somebody being able to look over everything. You should have the receipt paper locked up and used only for the purpose of receiving those types of things.
So a practical suggestion here too, if someone's name is on that tax receipt, guess who's going to get the phone call when the donor wants to know something? So if you're like myself, a finance person, I've had my name put on so my CEO doesn't call. So it's a way of sort of channeling complaints, if you will, and eliminating all those sort of panic attacks from those above.
Assuming you can read the signature.
Yeah, well, if you have a name also.
Yeah, usually you'll have a name underneath as well.
And also contact information, so just from a customer service standpoint, right?
And it really works under contract law here, where effectively an organization can authorize anybody to sign for things, but until that person is authorized to make that signature, technically that tax receipt is not valid. So you want to make sure that not only are you putting on an authorized signature and that it is correct, but you also want to make sure that the person is actually authorized to put that signature down. I've seen people clients put down, a database person being the authorized signature, and it's like, well, is that person actually authorized? Do you as an organization recognize that person as somebody who can do tax receipts. And if so, then that's all well and good, but generally it's not. And so generally you need somebody like a CFO or somebody authorized by the organization.
So is that like an internal authorization, or like I registered with
Yeah.
CRA saying that?
No, that would be internal authorization. CRA doesn't need to know this. All CRA really needs to know is that as an organization you've said, yes, this person can tax receipt.
Ideally, as part of the board approved signing policy, ideally.
Electronic receipting. So Raiser's Edge has the ability to do e-receipts. I'm not going to go into it today because e-receipts carry with it all sorts of fun caveats based on the way that Raiser's Edge or Blackbaud built the electronic receipting functionality. It's really cool, but it has problems. So want to talk a little bit about electronic receipting for a moment. So you can receipt electronically according to CRA and email a tax receipt. You have to protect the receipt as best as possible. And this is where Raiser's Edge actually falls flat. According to what you'll see at the bottom, CPS 014, that is Canada Revenue's policy on electronic receipts. They want you to use a secure system, so Raiser's Edge having a password-based system is theoretically secure. Copies need to be retained and ideally stored on non-erasable media and off-site. So from an IT perspective, this is often your tape backups or CD-ROM backups, those type of things, I guess DVDs. They are supposed to be encrypted. And we're talking about PDF encryption and designed so that they can be non-editable. Now the way Raiser's Edge does it is Raiser's Edge actually uses an open source PDF program to produce the PDF, which means that as of Office 2010, I can actually open it up in Microsoft Word and change it if I want to. So this is a particular problem. There are some people who do email tax receipts out of the Raiser's Edge. If you have Net Community, you are probably looking at or have done tax receipts straight from Blackbaud Net Community, which also does a very basic PDFing. So just so you know, this is not legislation. This is a policy by CRA. So this is what they've said you should do to protect it. But be aware that Raiser's Edge and the Blackbaud products do not actually do what CRA says you're supposed to.
So you can't out of Raiser's Edge issue a locked PDF?
Although I'd say like locked PDF is maybe a dream, an elephant. Like it's not a thing that really exists. I would say. I just think it's one of those places where the policy and the technical reality are just not aligned. They just don't see face to face.
Well, and we'll see this, I mean, the same thing happens with PCI compliance, right? PCI compliance, if any of you deal with credit cards, you are supposed to be PCI compliant, which means that you follow the credit card policies of the credit card companies. The actual policy for being PCI compliant is that you have encrypted credit card numbers, but they don't actually say what the encryption is or what they recommend. So if I were to add a 1 to every number, theoretically, that's encryption. So it is always that disconnect between technology and what is required. But basically, the policy that CRA tries to put forward is this should be protected as much as possible to prevent fraud.
So, regulation is supposed to be policy.
That's right.
So you're saying it's more intention versus the actual technical pieces behind it.
Yeah, so this is not legislative, right? So basically anything you can do to make it harder to edit a tax receipt, the better. And then one of the things to be aware of when it comes to record keeping, CRA wants anything that was sent electronically to be also saved electronically, so it can be reprinted at any point in time. And it should be easily accessible, so that auditors, if they come in, they can very quickly rerun the receipts and be able to see that, yes, this is what was sent. Special rule, if you're issuing a tax receipt to somebody in Quebec, you should be issuing a second receipt with the same number.
20 years I never did it. What?
And
That's
so
what the
so
say.
so this is a regulation of
Just
la
don't do it though.
yeah.
Just don't
Just
do it.
ignore it.
Ignore
I
it.
mean,
but this is a regulation of la département de whatever.
Before they had photocopies.
Yeah. But this is something that we do deal with, and mostly it's dealt with by Quebec Charities. Quebec Charities just know to do it and they do it. But this is what you're supposed to do, because what is supposed to happen is you're supposed to, when you file your taxes in Quebec, you are supposed to send one copy to the provincial authority and one copy to CRA. Of course, most people file their taxes electronically now, so one copy is usually enough. But this is just something to be aware of. Again, it's one of those, yeah, you can probably ignore it, and it's probably not going to be a problem. But just so that you're aware, this is what you are supposed to do.
sorry, you can mention foundations, because I know one audit I've been through, CRA heavily recommends, although not policy, not legislation, that you don't receive other charities.
You are no, it actually you are not supposed to receive other
You don't
charities
like
at
But
all.
again, not legislation.
Yeah, you're right.
Just recommendation.
It is a recommendation.
So, but I don't know how many other charities are aware of that, because there are some charities in town that are pretty resistant to that policy and pretty forceful about asking for charitable tax. Like, I think the Woodward's Foundation is one of them. They're pretty insistent about getting a charitable tax receipt every time.
Wow.
Yeah, which is, but again, it's not
Yeah.
legislation.
No, it's
recommendation.
not legislative.
It does make your, what is it, T3010 or whatever that form is, it makes that form much more confusing to fill
And you
out.
will get cited,
But,
you get audited, you will get cited in the audit.
But again,
Right,
it's a
so-
recommendation, not,
Yeah.
but if anyone's not aware, you're not supposed to offer charitable tax receipt to other charities.
Cited is different than a recommendation.
They will recommend you don't do it pretty strongly.
Yeah.
You
But
don't
again,
want
they
that
have no
going up
right to
chain.
recommend that.
And in fact, to go with that, I mean, there's a lot of reason why you wouldn't even receive organizations in general, because an organization is not going to be able to make use of a charitable tax receipt. They're going to write off the donation, right? Usually, you're tax receipting individuals. You can do both, but yes, you are right.
So I have a question. I've got donors who live in Quebec, and I only issued one tax receipt.
It's okay.
Again, it's not going to be a big deal.
Don't worry.
It's more, this is what you're supposed to do.
Okay.
But again, the funny,
We should
yeah,
have a caveat, like what happens in this room stays in this room, right? Like, not like a CRA mine or a whole other room here.
well, in the end, I mean, you're dealing with politicians who have many priorities, and I'm sure revising legislation to be up to date with today's technology is not, especially when it comes to charity receipting, is not really on the minds of all of the politicians in Ottawa or in Quebec.
What if there's a social enterprise attached to a charity, so it's technically the same name, but you make a donation to that part? Can you ask for a receipt?
I would ask CRA. I imagine you could,
That's
but
for profit.
but yeah, and I mean you're going to be effectively two legal entities. Right? So
You can issue the receipt,
You
you
can-
can, whether the social enterprise can actually use it.
Yeah.
It's up to them how they use it.
The social enterprise may treat it the same way as a corporation, where they
Yeah.
write it off, but
Yeah.
there's no problem to issue a
You can
tax
issue it.
receipt.
Even if it's technically the same name as the non-profit.
But
it'll
they should have a different
it'll have a different registration.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it wouldn't be, it shouldn't be exactly the same name, as a social enterprise and charity.
You have an entirely different problem if you have a charity who is actively making money and doing so under the charitable number. That's so reissuing a receipt, and this obviously comes up, especially because people change addresses and you don't know about them and things like that. So when you do a reissued receipt, you must still have all of the required information. You need to include the serial number of the original or previous receipts and statement that it cancels and replaces the original or the previous receipt. And on the receipt you have on file, you should be writing a very large canceled on it. So we'll talk a little bit more when we talk about Razor's Edge piece on some ways to perform that in Razor's Edge. But effectively, make sure that if you're reissuing a receipt that you do have some sort of statement such as, this receipt cancels and replaces receipt number blah.
Can't just photocopy the copy that I have on file. So I lost my receipt. I can't just like hit print again and send it to them?
Well, it's interesting because now in the era of electronic receipting, when I receive an email with a tax receipt, I can print it off 2,000 times. The thing is, if the receipt number hasn't changed and the information on it hasn't changed, a lot of charities will simply, because it takes a lot of time to reissue tax receipts, a lot of charities will simply go, well, here's another copy, because we live very much in that world. Again, this is one of those CRA versus technology of the time, right? Originally what would happen is your receipt number would be pre-printed onto your stock. So rather than, because CRA requires that the number be generated by a counting machine, right? So counting machine qualifies as a computer, but 20 years ago, right, you would have these pieces pre-printed. So the moment that you did provide a new receipt, it was a brand new number, and so you had to do all that cancellation. Yeah, most charities now, if nothing has changed at all, they will just provide another copy of that receipt, and you can generate it quickly from the Razor's Edge.
It should have a watermark across it saying reissued.
Yes.
Copy or something. Yeah.
And then if any piece of information changes, it should be cancelled. Whether that is a typo in the postal code to, a complete change of donor, it should be changed completely and cancelled. Storing records. Oh,
Okay, with everything, are you saying that if there's anything, like say there's little change of names, address, those kind of things, so it has to be a completely brand new receipt number?
yes. Now, the only time it does not need to be is if that receipt has not left your organization. So if you've printed it off and you're going through and go, oh crap, we spelled Kirk's name wrong, his name is not Crick, then you can actually cancel the paper copy and reprint it and send that out. But that is the only case.
But any other ways, like if they say the donor call, say, say like, the last receipt, blah, 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 right? Then we can just reissue the exact same information with just say duplicate receipts.
Correct. Now, when you're storing records for CRA, they must be kept a minimum of 2 years from the end of the calendar year in which the donations were made. So, anything for 2013 has to be stored until December 31st, 2015. You can store them electronically. Now, there's a few different ways you can do this, but they must be readable and easily accessible so that the auditors can look at them. As I said before with the e-receipts, anything sent electronically should be stored electronically. The retention rules stay the same. So whether it's a paper copy or an electronic copy, you must store it for those 2 years on non-erasable media, if possible, stored off-site. Now, you could store these electronic records as scans of the receipt, should you choose to. So if you have a machine that can quickly scan them and fire them off into the file system, that is perfectly okay as long as they are easily readable and easily accessible. So if you choose to go that route as opposed to just storing a PDF file where you've generated from the Razor's Edge, you actually want to have them scanned, and some charities choose to because you choose to store additional backup with it, right? Copies, a photocopy of the check, as well as maybe a pledge form, those types of things. As long as you are storing it in a way that's easily accessible and readable, that is perfectly okay.
Can I ask, so show of hands, who actually is keeping paper copies of tax receipts? Okay, and the rest, because I know when we hire our internal auditors, they are satisfied that Razor's Edge is the electronic the electronic backup. So are you suggesting that may not?
No, that is perfectly okay.
It's not necessarily accessible. I mean, the actual formatted receipt is not accessible.
Right.
But the information that would be on the receipt is accessible.
It can be generated quickly.
Okay,
Yeah. What we find a lot of, and it's hard to gauge what the room's going to be like. We encounter a lot of charities who have been told by their auditors, and usually it's not CRA auditors. Usually it's, random auditor who says, nope, you have to have paper copies and they have to be this and they have to be that. No, you can store them electronically. So, but the important thing is that you're doing it in such a way that they can be pulled up, right? And so when I used to work with Canadian Cancer, the auditors would often come to me and just go, they would actually sit at my computer with me and basically go, bring up receipt number 586. Okay. And they'd look at the gift record and go, okay, everything's fine. So that's usually okay, but yeah, there are definitely some charities who store paper copies even though everything's generated electronically now, and there really is no need for it.
We only keep with our telemarketers, their tax receipts, we keep a copy in file, but the ones for Razor's Edge that I've just done, I don't keep a backup for that, no, it's all,
The other thing to make sure that you are doing, and we'll talk a little bit about it in the Razor's Edge piece, make sure you are marking the records as receipted, because it actually does put it in a special table that cannot be edited unless you have access to the SQL. Cannot be edited, and basically will show the entire history of whatever was receipted on that gift. So if you do a receipt and then you reissue a receipt, that entire history is stored in a special table that is non-editable. So it's very important that you are doing that as well.
Sorry, can I ask, so Tamara, you were saying earlier that you're doing some tax receipts from your data warehouse. Are you then transferring that information back into Razor's Edge?
No, we're going,
So that's like a side.
we're using the same mail feature to export to the Excel. We have an Excel CSV that feeds the data warehouse. So we're doing almost exactly the same thing as everyone else, except we just have,
Instead of a merge, it's an export, effectively.
it's an export, and then the person who prints it always merges it to a PDF, but you can actually merge it to a Word if you want, but our procedure is that you send it to a PDF, so it's not editable. So the information has to be corrected at the Razor's Edge end
Okay.
without tons of modification.
Okay, so the challenge I'm having is our website we developed internally. It's receiving automatically. Then we're transferring that information to Razor's Edge because we haven't used the mail function. Razor's Edge is not tracking the fact that it's really been issued. And if we do a duplicate, we first have to sort of save it as the original receipt number by pretending to do a duplicate, so that it will force that read into the table. Has anyone found a workaround for that? If you're manually entering, okay.
No, there is no
Do
workaround.
everything you can.
No, and I know exactly what you're talking about.
So is anyone in that situation though, where they're manually entering a receipt number and it's causing them problems when they go to do duplicates?
Well,
Or
what,
no one's manually entering a receipt number?
what we do is we have a special queue, receipt stack, receipt type, and that's how we do our online gifts. So we have a special sequence of numbers that's.
Yeah, but
Yeah,
it's
you
not
do
burned
it.
into the table effectively.
Yeah.
So and really the only way you'd be able to really burn it in is you would have to run the reissue
Yeah.
process.
Then cancel it at any point.
Yeah.
Okay.
But then that would, on your receipt history report, that would not be accurate, would it?
No.
No,
Well,
so
it
your
would in
receipt,
a way. So the challenge I'm having is we have a pretty low volume of online gifts, so we're putting them in a batch on a semi-regular basis and committing the batch with the receipt numbers that our online system is assigned. The challenge is when you do duplicates, if you change your receipt stack, there's no history in Razor's Edge if you change your receipt stack. So if you're manually producing a paper replacement for an electronic receipt, you have no history that you've changed that receipt stack. So you've lost that original number either way. So we actually, it's a long thing. So what we wind up doing is, because we're manually entering the tax receipt number, if we do a duplicate, like a normal duplicate like you would any day, you lose the original number that you typed in because Razor's Edge doesn't really believe you. So you have to pretend you're doing a reissue to get it to force and save the number, so you can then do a duplicate and it will track the original receipt number. Explanation. Anyway, so just curious, I think we're doing the best we can.
Yeah, absolutely. And anytime you're importing data in,
Yeah.
you're kind of at the whim of that piece.
Yeah.
Do you, out of curiosity, do you use Importomatic?
No, again, our
Okay.
volume is really
Okay.
low online, so we're doing it
Yeah.
manually. I'm a bit of a control freak. I'd rather
Fair enough.
Yeah.
No, I do know for organizations that do use Importomatic, there is an API functionality, and there might be a way to tell it to do it, but
Don't do what I did. When I spoke to Black Bond, they told me I can issue the tax receipt, don't receipt it, don't acknowledge it, basically, and go back and do a global change. Don't do that, because it won't. No, that's what I was told by customer service at Black Bond. Don't, because then you won't have on each constituency, you won't have their receipt number, so it leaves it blank. So now, of course, when I go back and I receipt it instead of doing a global change, but the previous one I had to go manually input it because it loses the whole stack number. So never do a global change.
One thing you could do, just as a random thought, is when you're doing the import, you could maybe put the receipt number into the import ID so at least it exists.
Yeah, but
Somewhere.
you don't have that. Part of our challenge is, you get the same donor calling you over and over again about the tax receipt, right? So,
That donor, yes.
Yeah, every week. It's not here yet. They mailed it yesterday. They've been 3 days, right? And then they're the next day. So we rely on that little receipt check box thing to see our history and to not have the original receipt number there.
Problematic.
We've got our work around it. It's time consuming, but
I'm just, we get almost all of our online stuff through Canada Helps. We just use Canada Helps. I'm pretty sure they receipt, like, I'm
Yes.
new, so they receipt.
So Canada Helps is officially a charity,
Okay.
so they receipt on your behalf.
Okay.
And so actually, it's kind of another issue altogether, but when you are storing the data in Razor's Edge, theoretically, because Canada Helps is your donor, those people are not. As much as they donated to you through Canada Helps, they are not your donors. So most organizations, or at least organizations we deal with, put the gift under Canada Helps and then soft credit the donors. But that's one of those fun contentious issues. But-
We do it differently, Kirk.
Yes.
Yeah. We actually hard credit the donor and sub-credit Canada Helps.
The problem where that will come in is United Way. And the only reason that becomes a major issue with United Way is under your United Way contract, assuming you're getting gifts from United Way, you're not supposed to solicit their donors. And so hard crediting, basically you will end up with issues where you might accidentally do it and technically you're breaching the contract.
But if you do recognition, that would be a problem if you don't hard credit the donor.
But theoretically, Canada Helps has done the recognition for you. And this is one of those, you can argue for hard credits and soft credits one way versus the other, and
So basically it just depends on the fund from the foundation, right?
Last but not least, here are the two major resources I would use at any given time for receipting. Obviously, CRA. CRA actually has a really easy website to navigate when it comes to anything receipting. I guess the question is, I got a funny look. Have you looked at it in the last 3 months?
I looked at it today.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
I don't think it's changed.
Well, and actually, okay, I have a question for the group, because I actually looked at it today because we had an estate, sorry, I can't think of the term, complain to us about the date on the tax receipt because it's a year or two after the date of the death, and he wants it to, he says that Revenue Canada requires the date of the death on the tax receipt, and I've never heard of this, it's been around a while. So of course I do my CRA search, estate
Oh
gift.
no.
Well, anyway, so no, it's
Yeah.
not easy to navigate or helpful.
Okay.
Have you ever heard of that though?
Let me put the caveat. Don't search. It's funny if they've got the checklist for charities, which is really good because it has the receipting checklist, including everything you need there. And then there's a piece on basically running a charity, and that has a lot of the stuff about receipting and what you need to do with receipts. That part is okay to navigate. But yeah, the search, what you should know about the CRA search is that it is CRA. It is not just the charity component. So when you when you type in estates, you're getting everything.
No,
So-
and I think a lot of things are really not documented. I think a lot of things you have to call in, and calling in you do get some really good help and support, but I think a lot of things documentation-wise they're probably down.
And then one of the best resources, as I mentioned really briefly at the beginning, was Mark Bloomberg. He is a charity lawyer. That is actually what his law firm does, is basically creates charities. So people hire him to do that, and he provides an indispensable site, which has not just, well, one thing he has is the receipting toolkit, which is basically everything you could possibly ever want to know about receipting, and it's something like 150 pages. And then he has his global philanthropy website where he actually talks about creating charities and what you should know about legislation changes. He actually just did a webinar, I'd say about a month ago, on the brand new issues with spam law and how that affects charities. And it was actually before the announcement that charities would be exempt from that. So he was talking about all the things that you're going to need to know if charities aren't exempt. So he is the foremost expert in this country on charity law, so that's the other really good resource. So what I'm going to do is, because I need another drink and that's a lot of stuff, I'm going to take a brief break, and then, so please eat, drink, be merry, and in a few minutes I will start talking about the Razor's Edge side of this and what we need to do with respect to Razor's Edge to make sure we're compliant with CRA.